Hi, and welcome to this webinar on crossing the content chasm, chaos chasm rather, and where does records management fit in? Today I'll be presenting on content services, and records management and how it fits. The webinar will be shared, so if you don't catch something, you'll get a mail later. You can watch it later. So who am I? I'm in charge of business development here at Concept Searching, now part of Netrix. I've been working in information management for a long time. Oh, too long, it seems. And I'm an enthusiast with SharePoint and information management technology. Also a certified information management professional with AIM. I worked in information retrieval for a long time, and more recently with more generic information management, classification, and records management. So today I got a quick agenda. I'll tell you a little bit about our company. I'll talk about the content chasm, what we see in our day-to-day business as an issue that many organizations are having with the gap between what they're trying to achieve and where their information is now. I'll talk about that in the context of records management and the challenges we see there, and how to get across that. Of course, there'll be some product pitch in there. My apologies for that, but that's our goal here as well, is to convince you that you need what we do. And a short demonstration at the end to see how we can achieve that. Hopefully there will be value for you as well as the sales part. If you have any questions, feel free to throw them in the chat or into the questions box on GoToMeeting if you're a GoToMeeting aficionado. I will try to get to them at the end. If not, I will contact you directly with an answer to those questions, and we might publish them as well. So you can feel free to make them specific. We're not going to share any kind of private information with anybody. If you throw those in the chat, that'll be great. So who are we? We are managed metadata masters, let's call it. It's a little bit cheeky to call ourselves masters, but we have been doing this for a long time, some 17 years now. The company started as a search provider, a search engine vendor, but quickly shifted to doing classification because we saw a lot more value in that. Also, it was a crowded market that became very commoditized. We work with a lot of companies, largely financial services and government agencies, who have a lot of data and want to get that organized, make some sense of it. This starts with cleanup and goes all the way to on-demand classification. We've been recognized by the analysts. We're certified in the US government, so if you're a government agency, you have no worries that you can safely use and acquire the product. We have every vehicle there is out there to get the software to you. We're also a tight partner with Microsoft, part of the Content Services Partner Program. We're a charter member, so we work closely with them to make sure that our technologies are up to speed with what they're doing. It doesn't mean we only work with Microsoft. We work with a number of different platforms. So let's jump right into it. The content chasm. This photo is actually of a place called Chasm. My son and I visit there almost every year, but it's a big chasm in BC where I live. And really, when I look over that chasm, I think about the issues that many organizations that I talk to on a daily basis are having with their content, where they have this cycle. And this is kind of a rough picture. I made it myself. I'm sorry about that. But the issue is that we've got to get our content into a system that we can use. Maybe that content's sitting on file shares, or maybe we're using file shares as our content services platform. Maybe we've got SharePoint, maybe we've got OpenText or some other kind of system. But we've got to get that content in there, stored, and then make use of it. Then we may have some compliance concerns. When do we need to declare that information? How long do we need to keep that information? And when can we eventually get rid of that information? The problem is we have a lot of vendors that are selling us ECM systems, content services platforms, and they're great. They do a lot of stuff. Features are added all the time. SharePoint and Office 365 are perfect examples of this, constantly being updated. But our content just gets stuck in those systems. We never really get a good process once they're in the bottom of that chasm. And that's really what we're talking about, is the way to get down into the chasm is not as hard as the way to get out of the chasm, where we're going to archive this stuff and destroy it. And the interesting thing about this, and I think what we'll talk about, or maybe I can show today in this presentation, is that the problem is not the wall on one side of the chasm that we have to get up, but how we get down on the other side. How is this supposed to work? Well, we've all seen images like this. We've repurposed this image ourselves a number of times, where we have this perfect circle, and Microsoft loves to make these with its SharePoint platform. The circle, kind of the process that is ever revolving about how we have data captured and data rules, data flows, business processes, workflows that execute our content around some central information. And that may be metadata that we're using. We have our faithful and dedicated employees driving this metadata and this information through the systems, the ECM systems that we have, or content services platforms as they're now called. And we just hope that the structures that we build in these, maybe their workflows, their automated processes, are going to work. But we often find that data gets stuck places, it gets piled into one location, it is not properly utilized, maybe it's stored for far too long, or maybe it disappears. Things that we're supposed to have declared as records are suddenly nowhere to be found. Of course, a good symptom of this is when users come to you and say, I can't find my document. Of course, often it's a blame on the search engine. It's not good at returning the documents, but more often than not, it's just that that document is not there or is not properly identified as the piece of information they wanted. I think we've all been in that place where we know there's a document that exists, we've used that document before, but we just can't find it anymore. So what is the problem that leads to this? Well, content classification and content usage is really inconsistent. Analysts, in this case IDC, say that less than 50% of all content is correctly indexed. There's no metadata on it, and it's not searchable. That metadata that is on there, C. Cleverton says, is highly subjective. And we'll talk a little bit more about how subjective that is. Even highly trained information management people, really enthusiastic employees, will only agree on what kind of information should be on documents less than half of the time. Manual metadata tagging is a huge issue. Getting that information well organized so that it sits in our content services platform and then is surfaceable or disposable, manageable in a records management context is super expensive. We're throwing a lot of money at records management systems that are helping us to do things very late stage, which are not necessarily solving the problem that we have. And I think that's the biggest message here that I'm going to say throughout this presentation, is that the records management capabilities that are being delivered are very expensive, very specific, and don't solve the problem. Of course, in many cases, we need those systems. We need complex file management and disposition systems, retention schedule management systems, but they just don't work if we don't have the right content to operate those systems. There's also some other problems like malicious compliance. They're not that widespread. I think a lot of people are a little bit fear-oriented that you're going to have disgruntled employees out there putting their the wrong things on because they don't want to. But there is certainly an element of people who are apathetic and will just do something that is not necessarily appropriate. And of course, no perceived value. I think this is probably one of the biggest things. Is I'm working with content, I need to get my job done. What is it for me to help the records management people to get across this chasm? And of course, Information which is not communicated doesn't have any value, and we all have tons of that information that's sitting in our organization. It cannot be found, it cannot be utilized, it's not organized properly, so it becomes useless. I don't want to give any spoilers away, but it all reminds me of the end game, where we have vendors telling us that we have to worry about what happens at the end of our content lifecycle. Let's focus on our retention schedules. And when we get to 7 years, we want to delete a certain amount of stuff. We've got Thanos, who's the boss here, who's telling me that I have to destroy half of all the content. Costs a lot to store this stuff. A lot of it's garbage. Iron Man is really worried about some old project documents that he wants to repurpose. Captain America, he's a good boy. He's going to declare all the records. We've always got a couple of keen employees who are very dedicated. Thank God for them. But they're really the exception. Some people just want to type ASDF for everything and get moving with their life, not realizing the importance of having good metadata in order to drive a records management process. Some people want to put things to reduce storage in zip files or in different Dropbox or some other different kind of place to make their lives easier. Some people just store everything. And some people don't care. They won't do anything at all. So this is really the end game for our records management, is that we've got all sorts of different personalities doing different things and a mandate that we can't really drive. So let's talk a little bit more detail about the actual challenges of records management. Is it innovation or disruption to implement records management in an organization? Well, traditionally, we've used records in a file structure, in filing cabinets, and those kinds of patterns are really hard to get out of. Even the standards, a lot of the compliance standards and the Department of Defense standards are no exception to that, are based on how physical records were implemented in organizations. And these fail to scale. We're happy to have organizations like ARMA, which are doing great work to help electronicize those. Is that even a word, electronicize? To make electronic those processes. But a lot of the companies and organizations' processes are still very reminiscent of how physical records are being used. And confidence in this process is very low because it generally doesn't work. I'm always talking about a customer that I had who had 100,000 records all tagged as laundry basket. And one guy whose job was it to go through all of those records and figure out what the actual proper records classification was. And they had all of those documents classified like that because nobody knew what kind of records classification they should have. That really put a burden on that one person to do that. And that's kind of the recipe for having this low confidence. So records management professionals, records managers, must develop new processes that include all of the different kinds of systems that we're using now. And that can be a challenge in and of itself. This creates an added workload, creating written policies and guidelines that the organization must adhere to and become a burden for end users. Now we not only have to do our job as a contract manager or an accountant or a project manager, we have to worry about how records are being handled in the organization. Generally, the medium doesn't matter. If it's on your mobile phone or if it's on your desktop, we still need to have it managed. It's nice to have it in a system that has records management capabilities, but if our end users are not going to use that, it really becomes a burden. And most importantly, there's really no way for most people to identify what a record should be. We do a lot of work where we try to put things into drop-off libraries or folders and then just force classify everything in that folder as a particular kind of record. But as you probably experienced, we'll get a lot of noise, we'll get things classified that shouldn't be classified, and we get people who just don't want to do that process. There's a lot of hurdles to how that is done. Training can be expensive. I'm not going to underestimate the power of getting end users and people involved and owning the process, but really it becomes a distraction from most people's jobs. So records management also becomes information governance, and this is important because records management has a number of different aspects to it that are incredibly important, and information governance is records management. If we want to be able to govern content, we need to be able to identify what it is, where it is, and whether it should be declared as a record or not. Whether we declare them as records doesn't mean that it's not a record. I've heard from a number of people in the space that we should just consider everything a record. It's either a record that needs to be kept or it needs to be destroyed. And we should be managing everything as records. I won't go that far. I'd say there's a lot of things like draft content and content that we just need to have around in case we need it that maybe shouldn't be a record, but there is an interesting perspective that if it's not classifiable as a specific kind of record, maybe it shouldn't be there at all. So to get to records management, we really need to do a certain number of things with records, like assessing risk on specific content, mitigating that risk, getting rid of content that we don't need, and being able to do an audit, a defensible audit on our content. Also managing the processes that we have for the content. Is it going to maintain a record through that process? What part of that process does it need a record? And how do we get to all of this? Well, really the key is classification. As we see in this process, we identify content and then we classify it. And this is where most of our records management process breaks down. It's not at the disposition stage. It's not the ability to delete things or save them to PDF-A or archive them somewhere. It's really how to identify them, because if we can't identify them at this early stage, this whole process breaks down. So those classifications issues start with manual metadata tagging. As we saw in our Avengers issue, we've got all sorts of manual processes and personalities which are doing different things with our metadata tagging, and that stops our classification. That means we can't store the content properly, we can't retrieve the content properly, and we'll never be able to preserve it or destroy it. This also, as I mentioned just in the last slide, opens us for these legal liability. So if we haven't destroyed content that has sensitive information in it, we're opening ourselves to liability for that content. There might be something that we should have destroyed that has us legally liable. And really, we can't get there unless we've got it properly classified as something that is a legal issue or contains information about a specific topic that we want to get rid of. Of course, we also can't preserve that content properly if we don't have it properly classified. But time and again, organizations are trying to classify things in order to manage them in a records management process manually. We're going to try to get all of these Avengers to go out in our organization and give the right classifications, give our file plan to these documents, and it's just not working. So what's the solution? Well, of course, the solution is to properly identify this content early on. We give this content some information that's going to help us to find it, manage it, and then eventually do all these other processes. Without that information, or what we're going to talk about, metadata, we can't do that records management long term. Where we believe this starts is really before even tagging. because the manual tagging is an issue, but it really needs to start with a controlled vocabulary before, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. And that starts with taxonomy management. And then automatic metadata generation and document metadata tagging. Once we have this information, this properly identified information in place, all of the remaining processes around records management are going to work seamlessly. And the tools that you've spent a lot of money on to help you to track, store, retrieve, like search engines, and eventually destroy or preserve or put legal holds on, is going to work because we've got that extra data to help those automatic processes work and not rely on our end users. So what is the key to records management success? I think I've already explained that. It's metadata and transforming that information that we have in our documents, maybe that's contextual, maybe that's content, into information that we can use in our metadata process. And this is really the key, the difference between classification. The reason why we've spent a lot of money on OpenText or M-Files or SharePoint or whatever our content services platform is going to be, our enterprise content management system is going to be, is the difference between classification and filing. And we buy these expensive tools because they can do processes that are based around classification, based around metadata, not just filing. If we're just doing filing, a file share will do. So these two challenges that we're approaching with content services are using content services for records management, but also, and I think this is an important part of records management that we don't often discuss, is compliance. And people talk a lot about compliance. We're now in a company that does compliance auditing and security for companies. And a lot of the dialogues we have with those people deal with compliance as a separate topic. But really, organizations, if they have proper records management going on, compliance will follow with that, because compliance is really a subset of proper records management. Most organizations deal with it separately. We want to get compliant with our content, but we don't want to do records management. That's something that is too nerdy for us. It's only like, you know, for this one person to worry about. But really, if you're doing proper records management, compliance is going to follow along, and compliance should really be part of records management. So if you've got your records properly managed, your content identified as records, will be able to be compliant as well. Most organizations are not good at either because they don't really get that. And the consequences of non-compliance are severe. I don't think I even need to go into that part. So how do we address these issues? Well, largely the issue, as I mentioned, is about classification, but you've got to step back in that process. And we believe that the starting point for that is having a controlled vocabulary. So this controlled vocabulary is going to help us drive all sorts of different processes: compliance, records management, security, improving search, doing text analytics, cleanup, reducing storage. Because if we can properly identify our content, we can drive all of these processes. If we cannot properly identify the content, we have no idea how that information is being handled or utilized in our organization. So really, we have to start with a controlled vocabulary and build a taxonomy. I'll show you a little bit about in our product how we do that. You don't need a product like ours to do it, but doing it manually is going to be a big challenge. This will also help with generally better information architecture. If you understand what content you have and you understand the business processes, you can put them together and get a much better information architecture. The struggle with a lot of my customers is they're like, I need a new architecture, but I don't know where to start. Do I need to talk to everybody? These are the business processes, but how does my content fit into those buckets? Controlled vocabulary is really where you need to start. And of course, the result from this can help a number of different ways, including cleanup, reducing storage, deleting garbage, and managing records. So here's our process again. I've simplified it from what we saw in the chasm, but it's basically we're getting information into our document management systems, our enterprise content management systems, our contents services platforms. This is what I have as DMS here. You can call it a number of different names, but it's one of these tools that we've installed so that we can store and manage this content. And we've got that process in place, but there's some gaps, and that's our chasm. And that's where we fit in. We fit in bridging that chasm and by giving you information about your content that can help you to drive the processes in these systems. And that's really where the magic happens. You might want to migrate content to your DMS. You might want authors to automatically update that content. You might want all sorts of other processes to drive, but if you don't have the proper information, you can't get that done. So this just helps in a lot of different areas and not just records management, but it is really key. It's probably most important with records management. If we don't know what should be a record, how are we ever going to manage that? I think I'll skip by the history of auto classification and just jump to the goal here. We really want to fend off or shun manual tagging. I know this is kind of an ironic meme, but we really want to not do manual tagging. It's not good for our organization. It's going to cause more problems. I often say to people, what is worse, having no data or bad data? And of course, bad data is worse because it's going to drive bad processes. It's going to drive incorrect classifications, and it's going to give us a problem. Auto tagging is really the way to go because we can do it across the organization. We can do it consistently, and we can do it in a much faster process than asking end users to do that process. So on to exactly what we do. We have the ability to use semantic and statistical values to identify what kind of information you have in your organization and tag it as such. To do that, we need to manage metadata, we need to control vocabulary with a taxonomy, and we need to be able to apply that out with rules on the content that we have. This is going to give us a foundation for consistent tagging across the organization. There are many tools that do similar kinds of things, but concept searching is unique in that we are a statistical engine. We haven't got fancy AI because we haven't seen it work yet. But we do know from our 17 years of experience that our statistical engine works very well. And we have a lot of customers who agree with that and are very committed to the product. We have a unique technology called compound term processing, which both finds single word terms, but also phrases in your content. We can help surface information in your organization and allow you to do intelligent metadata generation from your actual vernacular. We're not bringing in some rule set from somewhere else. We're not guessing. We're not forcing you to ask employees. We can actually look at the content you have and determine what it's about and then organize it. Typical example of this is triple heart bypass. If you've seen our webinars before, you've seen this example before. This is really one thing. You know, this is a surgical operation, a heart operation. But each one of these terms have different meanings. And if we're using something that doesn't identify triple heart bypass as one thing, say for example, simple keyword-based classification tool, which there's several out there. Microsoft provides one like that in Office 365. We're going to get bad results because it's going to find these way too many hits, what we're calling false positives for these things. But because we're able to identify these compound terms, we're able to see exactly what kind of information your organization has and help you tag that for your records management context. I think I'm going to jump forward and do the demo so that you can see what I'm talking about in real life. I'll try to keep it quick, and then maybe we can grab a few questions at the end. So just jump over to my. So this is what the concept searching platform looks like. It's web-based. It's meant to be quite easy, sometimes not so easy. But the idea here is that we have a few processes in order to help us identify. And in this context, I'll talk about records. So first of all, we want to crawl our systems. Concept searching is a crawler-based technology. It's a search-based technology, as I mentioned. So the goal is to go out and collect all of the information. We connect to a number of different systems like file shares, Exchange, open text content server, Box, Salesforce, Google Drive, all sorts of different systems. And we go out and collect the information from those systems, gather up the documents from those systems without installation of any kind of agents on those systems. So it's very lightweight in that case, and it scales very well. Let's just take SharePoint, for example. Once we've collected information from the systems in place, which is a crawler-based technology, as I mentioned, we can go in and look at what we've collected. We open the documents. We support a number of different document types, and we collect all of those documents information. So all the text from that document and all the metadata. We also generate metadata based on natural language processing and do what we call entity extraction so that we can get some more information about what that document is. This gives us the power to automatically find out information about that document that you wouldn't be able to maybe find if you asked a user to do it or if you just looked at the document. So there's lots of information in here that we can then utilize to do something with that document, maybe classify it or identify it as non-compliant or put it into a file plan, which is really in the records management context what we want to do. We want to give it a records classification, and then we want to manage it through its life cycle. Now, concept searching doesn't do the management part. We're going to lean on something like SharePoint or OpenText to do that management part. But what we can do is identify a specific item as a type of record and then tell that system how it should manage it, right? So with SharePoint, we can either apply a label to the content, or we can change its content type or write a file plan item to it, automatically giving it that value, not relying on our end users to do that job and do it poorly. So once we've got that information collected, the next step is, of course, to figure out how that should be classified. And this is where the big gap really comes. So here we've got a file plan that we've created. This taxonomy manager is really simple to use. You can add new terms, you can move things around, you can make new taxonomies. We have any number of different taxonomies here that we can use to do things like compliance or records management or whatever we want. In this file plan that I've created here, I've got several different nodes. And I'm sure if you're a records manager, you're familiar that asking your end users to choose one of these. So let's say I'm in SharePoint and I want my end user to choose a records classification for this particular thing. Say we have a record type or a content type that we might want to use this. How are these users going to decide what they should be? Well, this is in the finance folder, but which finance item is it? You know, I've got tons in here. This is just too daunting for my end users to going to do. And just like our Avengers there, they'll probably just choose the top one. Yeah, I'm just going to put it into this one because I can't be bothered to do that records management. So what we offer is the ability to automate this process. What we'll do is we'll allow you to create fuzzy rules that will match documents. You'll get all of the documents and only the right documents, in place for these things. It's better than just having keyword rules like you might find in AIP, because we are giving you the ability to hone and add values to the different items in order to match them. We also can suggest clues, and this is really a cool and unique feature based on our statistical engine, that we can go out and say, if you're looking for audits, these are statistically similar terms that you might want to add as clues. I can even add these as a sub node in my taxonomy, which is super powerful for building out taxonomies. So I could create this one as a child term. Financial regulation is an important term that I need as a child term. And I can add these as different clues to find the proper documents that I want. So I'll just make that a standard clue, and then I can save those and have these clues. I can change the values. Our statistical engine will actually suggest a value. I can increase that or decrease that. I can also see all of the documents that were classified already, find out why they were classified. And I can either promote them or demote them statistically based on, so add it to a positive working set or a negative working set, based on the values that I find in these documents. And that's going to help us to get exactly the right classifications that I want here. Once these are classified, I can automatically write these back to my target system or my source system, like SharePoint, for example, and get these classifications written back. I can also change content types on the documents or declare records if I want. So really, the best key to augmenting those content management systems, those content services platforms, is to have a tool like this that can identify what the content is, classify it. You can also see from the terms I have here, you can do multiple classifications across this documents. So we're giving it many different facets, and all of these different facets are helping that information to become more rich, more discoverable, more effective, and manageable as a record in the organization. So if you're interested in seeing more about this is kind of just a very short demo, so you could see the product. But if you're interested in seeing more, please reach out to me, and I'd be happy to give you an exact demo and maybe show you how it might work in your own content. Let's jump back. And then hopefully I'll have time, a couple minutes for a couple of questions. So what's the return on investment? Well, there's a lot of statistics here about how much time is spent on different areas. Search is a huge area where people are wasting a lot of time. I know I do that as well. And the cost of that is massive. It's been tried to calculate. They tried to calculate it a number of times, but we all know from just the amount of time that we search for things, that we recreate content, that it can be a large amount of time. Also security, the average cost of a security, and we've had customers come to us many times because they don't have things properly managed, and then they have leaks, and then they've spent money on fines, and then they come to us, where really they should come to us beforehand and help us mitigate those risks so that they don't get fines for security. Data breaches are still and continue to be a massive cost to organizations. We really have very poor control of our records, and data loss and maybe storing things too long is also another huge risk. So all of these areas, including metadata usage to help improve processes and employee productivity and governance, really all hinge on proper classification, proper quality of data. And so your return on investment is going to be multifaceted and very easy to see if you start to do records classification. I can't stress enough that there are a lot of laws and regulations out there, and GDPR and the new California state privacy laws are just the latest in an ongoing influx of privacy laws that really show that we need to do records management and content management properly. There is a lot at risk, so we should do it. So let's talk about next steps. As I said, please reach out to me directly if you want to see a demo. We will send you the recording and everyone who's registered the recording. So if you're interested in seeing some of the topics and the stuff a little more detail, we'll get there. But let's take a couple of questions. I do have, I think, a couple of minutes to talk about that. Let's see, what questions do I have? I have file shares and an old intranet we are moving to 365 online. Where's the best place to start with records management? Okay, so this is a great question. This is something that actually we talked about in my last records management, or not records management, Office 365 user group, is where do we start with all of these processes? And especially if we're talking about migration scenario. And really the place to start is twofold. First of all, clean up. Let's get rid of the junk wherever it is now, because why are you trying to classify and identify records in garbage? So let's do cleanup first. There's always redundant, obsolete, trivial content. There's old stuff. You know, if it's more than 10 years old, probably the chances you need to make it a record are 0%. So let's do cleanup first. And the next is to do information architecture. If you're moving to something like Office 365, don't just do a lift and shift. Reconsider how that content is going to be valuable and move it. Of course, doing classification in that process is going to help you to do that reorg, because now we're going to see where those things are. And involve the users. There was a gentleman at our user group who's one of our board members, and he said that he's had great success with involving some of the key users in doing that information re-architect. And that's kind of the key to success in the long term, is helping them to get those classifications. And with a tool like ours, you can actually engage those people with that in that process and say, look, here's the words that we've identified. Here are the documents that we can see are potential records. What do you guys think? Where should they be? How is that going to help you with your business? So instead of just demanding that those people do that, like our Avenger slide, let's get them involved and give them some information to help them open that picture up. You mentioned you can declare a record. How declare a record? So yeah, it really depends on the source system. We have a process in Concept Classifier, which we call workflow, and that can do different things. So we can actually change processes. We can write things to SharePoint. We can change the content types, and we can. We also have an open API where we could trigger things in SharePoint or in another system. So it could be a system like OpenText that has an open API where we can write a workflow that goes and triggers that depending on what we've had. We can also do things like have a approval process. So we might identify something as a record and send an email to that record's owner and say, hey, this is a potential record. Why don't you have a look at it and declare it as a record if you want. So there's a lot of different options depending on what your business requires, whether that's automatic declaration or having a business process, or maybe in launching another workflow in something like SharePoint that can initiate that process. So the answer to that is really it depends on the source system. But there's a lot of flexibility in doing that. Our biggest strength is, of course, identifying those, but we can also do a lot of different actions so to automatically process those things. I think time for one more question. What's the best way to build rules for classification, content or metadata? Okay, I guess this is in respect to the rules that we have in Concept Classifier. I would say that it depends on the business process. Of course, you want to use both your content and your metadata to identify, to build a profile around the document. and then look at the rules. This tool that I showed where you can ask for suggestions for clues to build those rules is super valuable in that. We can see what kind of information or what kind of clues we have, and then automatically write values to that. So I would say do a mix. Probably, let's say we have, we want to look for documents. Let's say that we want to look for all the project documents related to a specific company. We can actually enter that company name into the clues. Maybe I can just show you that quickly at the tail end here. We can enter that company name into the clues. I think I might have a company name here. And then ask the system to give us some suggestions around that company name. And it'll actually go and find statistically similar terms, I don't know if I have any here, that are close to this term, Contoso. And then we can maybe go out and add those as clues. So we can also do things like add metadata. So if your file name includes Contoso in it, the company name, we're going to give that some value. We're going to automatically classify that as well. It's not an exclusive rule, or it's we can classify it if it says Contoso in the file name, but we can also classify it if it says Contoso in the document as well, or maybe some other things as well. So using both content and metadata can give us a much richer way to go out and find all of the content we're looking for. Next step, of course, is to look at that content and find out why it was classified as Contoso, see if that's correct, and then modify our rules a bit so that we can get a much better classification. Well, that's all the time I have. If there are any other questions, I see there might be some. We will get back to you with the answers directly. Thank you so much for attending my webinar today. I really do appreciate it, and I hope to hear from at least a few of you. Have a great day.